So, hi, we have with us a very, very interesting talk today with Ruchika Tulshyan. She has originated from Singapore, but currently lives in the United States since the last 10 years. She's an author, keynote speaker, and founder of Candour, an inclusion strategy practice. A former international business journalist, Ruchika is now a regular contributor to the New York Times and Harvard Business Review. I'm extremely honored, Ruchika, to have you on our platform, and I'm very grateful that you could take some time off. We have an interesting book coming out from her, The Inclusion on Purpose, an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work. Ruchika, thank you so much for joining us. And the book releases in Feb 2022. We can do a pre-order soon. Ruchika, thank you so much. Let's start by talking about your book. What was your purpose behind writing the book?
Thanks so much for having me, Shraddha. And when I thought about how corporate programs here in the United States and really around the world are structured, I think of, you're Shraddha, you're based in India, and there is a chapter in my book that looks specifically at global challenges to creating inclusion in the workplace. And here in the United States, what I started realizing is a lot of the programs and a lot of the initiatives and approach to running inclusion was still centering people who were already powerful, who already had a say in the workplace. So even when we were looking at increasing gender diversity here in the US, in the workplace, we were really asking the question of, okay, well, what do white women need to succeed? And what are the tools and programs and processes they need to feel included, which left out a significant percentage of the population. You think about in India, and the chapter where I wrote about India, a lot of the programs again only focus on urban women, from higher castes who have education, who have privilege. And that's important, certainly, but you can't center and create true inclusion if you only center these voices. And so the book looks at how caste plays out in India, religion, especially professional Muslim women, for example, women who are rural, for example. So I think we need to create a much more deeper understanding when we say inclusion to make the type of change that we want. So the impetus for the book really came about from my own experience as a woman of color, an Asian woman, a South Asian woman, an immigrant woman here in the United States. And I've been advising on diversity and inclusion for close to a decade now. And what I would see again and again is I'd go in and I'd work with these corporations and organizations, and largely the focus was, how do we only propel the women who are already present, and how do we just make those women more successful? There was no focus on what it's like to be really underrepresented, being the only Asian, being the only Black woman, being the only Latinx woman. So that really created a fire in my belly, because the research is clear, right? In the next few decades, we are in the United States and in many parts of Western Europe, women of color are really going to become much more present in the United States. Eventually, we will be the majority of working women, but also around the world, quote unquote, the people who have largely been thought of as the minority are soon going to be the majority, and we need to think about that.
So, Ruchika, in terms of the obstacles, right? Where do you see the obstacle or the root problem lies? Is it that belief systems are not wired that way? Is it, there is a lot of bullying in the corporate? So where do you see, the root of the problem?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. I think a lot of our systems, especially corporate systems, was set up with oppression firmly in place. This is obviously a little bit of a it's not a very diplomatic answer. It's the truth, which is always tricky and creates little bit of defensiveness. But the reality is, a lot of these corporations were set up to be exploitative, to take advantage of those who were at the lowest rungs and primarily that's been women, and that's been people of color, that's been people who are less educated, who have been exploited and left out of the system for a number of years, centuries, even in some cases. So I think we do need to rethink the systems and reshape them in many ways if we want to try and create a workplace that allows everyone to bring their whole selves to work. And this is not easy, right? It means that some people right at the top will have to give up power. It means some people will have to rethink and really address their biases, their prejudices at their core. And that's something that I talk about in the book. And it, at its core, it'll also mean that we need to develop deeper empathy for people who are different than us, right? I think that even all over Asia, especially growing up in Singapore, there was a very strong idea that, the world is meritocratic. If you work hard, you can get ahead. If you get the education, you can get ahead. That's it. Like it's all about you. If you didn't work hard enough, that's why you're not successful. That's why you're not progressing in your career. And that narrative is very false, and it's harmful. It has continued to leave people out who have experienced systemic barriers, oppression, poverty, gender inequality, etc., etc. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done.
So I just want to make it a little clear and crisp for the viewers out here. So when we're talking about inclusion, are you only talking about the gender? You're talking about race? What are we referring to?
No, not at all. In my work, I focus on intersectionality, which was a term, created in 1989 by a Black feminist legal scholar, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. And her work and her definition of intersectionality focused on the experience of Black women, right, who have historically been the most marginalized here in the United States. So, Professor Crenshaw really looked at how Black women's experiences, both women and Black people, would compound and create a very negative experience in the workplace, not only because they were women, not only because they were Black, but that intersection of being Black and female in the workplace would have a very negative impact. Now, all these decades later, that is still true and still very relevant. That's a very important lens in which to look at the experience people have in the workplace, which of their identities are historically oppressed, and how does that impact the experience in the workplace. So keeping that view in mind and centering that, because it is the work of a Black feminist scholar, and I want to make sure that she gets the credit for it. I think now we are really widening the lens to include certainly gender and race, and that is very important. That is how I center my work too, but especially other forms of historic marginalization in the workplace and in society, whether it's LGBTQ people, yes, whether it's people with disabilities, people with various mental health presentations. I mean, we must widen the lens and realize how many of these identities will really, when they intersect, they really compound the experience. If you're a woman of color, where gender and race is how you present outwardly, if you also have an invisible mental health challenge, for example, that will also deeply impact your experience in the workplace, which was largely created for a very, very shallow and very sort of privileged type of normal, right? And anyone who deviates from that in any way, anyone who presents in any different way, is very much harmed in the workplace.
And I think we're seeing that a lot in COVID, right? So we've seen work from home scenarios, and especially with gender biases in India, as you pointed out. So specifically, we have seen a rise in mental health issues. A lot of studies coming out that yes, the primary caretaker is the woman, and so can organizations provide them with more supportive care and leaves on the weekends. So I think these are very firm, rules and regulations that need to come across, because people are having a lot of breakdown.
Absolutely. And we've seen it at large here. I mean, there's a study that says, for men here in the United States, jobs have returned to a presence in the workforce for men has returned returned to pre-COVID levels right now, and 18 million fewer women in the workforce right now. So we know that COVID has deeply impacted women. And again, here, those who have most been marginalized by race, Black women, Latinx women, Native Indigenous women have really been left out of the workforce as a result of COVID, or been underemployed and underpaid and exploited. So, a lot of work to be done for sure.
So, like you said, these have been patterns that have been going on for generations and decades. So we also see in psychology there's a lot of work done on cognitive biases, the structures that we have. So what do you think are certain biases, like, which are inherent in the entire system, that is not giving us a freedom or autonomy for, a colored Asian or a Black woman to come out in the corporate space?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think gender bias runs really deep in patriarchal systems. One of the things I say, and one of the things that a framework I created for my class when I taught is, that it's not men who are the problem, it's patriarchy, right? It's not white people who are the problem, it's white supremacy and racism. It's not straight people who are the problem, it's homophobia. And you go down the list. And I think one of the reasons why it's really important to remember it's a systemic issue is because then individuals who are highly represented, a part of the dominant in group, can feel very defensive.
Yeah.
I'm a good person, like I believe in gender equality, I believe in racial equality, I do this, I do that, here's how I show up. And it's less to do with that. It's what you said is correct. There are a lot of cognitive biases built into the system, right? And one of the main biases that we're still tackling today is gender bias, right? At its very core, in a patriarchal system, study upon study has found that even when women, and again, white women, women with privilege, women with educational privilege, when they are able to ascend even to the highest levels of representation here in the United States, they still face a lot of gender bias. They still face, for example, the double bind, where they walk this narrow tightrope between being liked and being respected. They still face issues such as being interrupted and talked over in meetings, given less credit, thought of as less sort of worthy. There are studies that have found that, in meetings where women talk more often, they are given even women leaders are given more negative ratings and considered less impactful or less positive as a leader. Whereas when men display the exact same behaviors, they're considered great leaders, like great ideas, great thoughts. So we have I think the gender bias is very much at the core of it. Given the important work you do, Shraddha, with reality and you, I think it's important to talk about, we're just scratching the surface of
Yes.
how mental health biases against, and again, that intersectional lens is really important because even when it comes to women, a lot of the ways that women are dinged in the workplace, the way that a lot of women experience negative performance reviews, comes from that history of gender bias and female hysteria, female madness, the way that there was a lot of this woman is not going to be qualified to do this because she's emotional. We saw this, unfortunately, in a very big way in the US presidential elections a few
Yes.
years ago.
Yes.
And all of these diagnoses and misdiagnoses and a lot of these biases, like, oh, women are too emotional to handle this important work that needs to be done, or women can't make good decisions, we don't do, so there's a lot of that intersection between what we consider, to be stable and steady and displaying, normal mental health. And I know the word normal is really, I use it in a very careful way here, right? Like, who even defines what's normal? But what is normal mental health behavior and tendency, and that intersection between how we define women as being less than, too emotional, too hysterical, etc.
I read, your Instagram page, and I think one of the implications would be the imposter syndrome of, constantly not feeling good enough, regardless of the success that you've achieved. What are your thoughts on that? What are the implications that you're seeing on women primarily, and especially, women of color?
Yeah, and Shraddha, I'm really glad you brought that up. And especially, I'd love your expert opinion because when I and my co-author Jodi Ann Bury wrote about imposter syndrome, we wrote this article in Harvard Business Review in February. We did not expect, that it would be read around the world, translated in all these different languages. One of the most successful articles in Harvard Business Review's history, and I think for us it was trying to just change this idea on its head that women have imposter syndrome, because we would hear it all the time. It was really frustrating. Both of us, when we talked about it, and I can speak for myself, I really don't identify with this term of imposter syndrome. Have I experienced exclusion in the workplace? Absolutely. Have I experienced bias and prejudice? Absolutely. Have I shared an idea and had it shut down, or people say, oh, you're so silly, like you don't know what you're talking about? Absolutely. Is there something internally that told me I wasn't good enough? Not before I started experiencing that bias
Yep.
and prejudice. It isn't like I woke up, I was born and I woke up and I thought, oh, I'm a woman, I experienced imposter syndrome. It was these little, microaggressions, as people say, that really compounded. And one day I was just like, this doesn't feel right. Like society tells me I'm a woman, so I should have imposter syndrome, but actually it doesn't feel like there's something internally wrong with me. I'm pretty confident with who I am.
Yeah, and I remember I put up a post on this on my Insta page through COVID, and I think some of the women really related to it, but not much work is being done in India, especially. So, where do you see, where are we going wrong? What can institutions, organizations, what are the steps and strategies that they can take forward?
I think we really need to attack the gender schema, the gender norm, the gender binary, which are three different things. But we need to kind of really dismantle them, because it's very harmful. And I've seen this. I worked in India, for a short period of my career. I've obviously been to India many times, being of Indian origin. And I think one of the challenges is this expectation that women are to be really docile, that
Yeah.
of course they're going to have confidence challenges. It's a very condescending, patronizing, patriarchal approach, that women, of course, they're not going to be confident of themselves and take these decisions. And what I really hope, and what we've seen here in the US and in other places, and don't get me wrong, I had some amazing male mentors and peers as well for the short time that I was a journalist in India, is having more people who have privilege and power. That's historically been men, that's historically here in the US been white men. In India, that can be men with educational and socioeconomic privilege, caste privilege, etc. But what we need is more, especially men and people in positions of power, to step up and say, I believe that this woman can succeed, right? Like, if you're the manager, if you are the sponsor, if you're the advocate of this person, you should be able to say, I believe in you. I don't think you have imposter syndrome. I don't think you need to be shy about your ambitions, or you need to put them on the back burner. I believe that you can be very successful. And one of the good examples I read recently, I mean, it was really a wonderful read, was Indra Nooyi's
Yes.
memoir, My
Yes.
Life in Full.
Yeah.
And she talks very candidly about how largely it's men who have sponsored her, who have handed her the top job, who have said, I believe in you. Of course, she also talked about some of the biases and racism that she experienced. But that, I think, where corporations can change is from a more institutional level. I think create programs where women, people of color, people from other underestimated identities are sort of mentored, sponsored, and brought along for to success. But I also think it's the job of individual leaders and managers to take that responsibility and and really squash those doubts in the moment. If you're in a meeting and you hear someone says, oh, Ruchika's not really smart, or, Shraddha's got confidence issues, as a male mentor and leader, I should say, I don't observe that.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? I think she's great. I think she can absolutely succeed and lead.
No, I think with the Me Too movement happening in the US, I think we also did see some cases in India where women started standing up and, finally speaking out on whatever they were going through. So whether there was verbal or physical bias, physical abuse in that in an environment, it was spoken about. But I think there was a phase and it sort of melted down. So what do you think people who have been discriminated against, where can they go? It's mostly happening in an environment which is supposed to be safe and secure.
Yeah, I think this is what made me sad about the Me Too movement is, amazing momentum. I think what we started seeing is that the resistance to creating a more inclusive and safe environment for women is still very, very deep, right? And what we started seeing is the women who would come forward, even where they were able to band together and come forward, they would experience retaliation. They would experience, all of those things where it was clear that it was a very big risk for them to speak up, and they were not going to have the protection they needed to do that. And so I can imagine that again, many other people who might have wanted to come forward were given the sign that actually it's not safe to do that, you better shut up. So that's really sad. I think that's something that was the drawback of the Me Too movement, where again, largely the people who are able to speak up were already, again, talk about intersectionality, people who are already well protected, who had the socioeconomic privilege to hire lawyers, to hire whatever the team that they needed, and they still experience retaliations. You can imagine if you depend on your job, you to pay the bills, you don't have societal privilege. I know that there was a lot of talk about the women from Dalit caste women and etc., who were really, really harmed by the Me Too movement, in the sense that they knew that they could never speak up in quite the same way. So I think that there's a lot of again, work to be done, and I think this is where corporations need to step up.
Do you think the culture plays an important role? As a culture, are we, is the US more forward than India? With COVID and the world coming much closer through Zoom meetings, it's going to be difficult. We need to be more sensitive globally as a world.
Yeah, I think I'm always very careful to say that the US is very far ahead other countries, because I think firstly there's the legacy of colonialism and exploitation, and the history of, India is a prime example. You can't be exploited for centuries and then expect to operate as a fully functioning democracy at the same way that, for example, the United States is. So I think that connection of democracy and functioning democracy and financial growth and all of that it's not an apples to apples comparison by any stretch of the imagination, because then you're ignoring this history, which is a very big history. At the same time, where I think that there could be a greater greater awareness is very much around the work you do, right? And I think that there can be a lot more destigmatization of mental health issues in the Indian workforce and in society in general. And I unfortunately know many examples of both people within India as well as in diaspora Indians around the world who refuse to seek mental health, both on a personal level, and certainly would never talk about it with a boss or a leader or anything like that. Even had a student years ago who here in Seattle, even though she had been born and brought up in the US, she was of Indian origin and talked a lot about huge mental health challenges in her family. And she said, I don't know who I can turn to about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think there is always, like you said, the leaders have to stand up and speak and empower the women.
Right.
empower such conversations around the office space. So, do you think as, since you're into policies and you've, now written a book about this, do you think we need to, on a fundamental level through the government, ensure that we have these policies in place?
Definitely. I mean, I think that there's role of the government, definitely. And, we've seen huge mental health crises here in the US where, there's a real lack of capacity, right? And our services are stretched. We see a lot of these issues here. I live in the Seattle area. We see huge issues of, addiction and other mental health crises just left unaddressed because there's no capacity. So absolutely the government needs to prioritize it. I do think it is also the role of company leaders, right? And Shraddha, I will say, like, I think, at least from what I remember, the discourse around gender inequality, for example, using one pretty simple, easy to understand example, gender inequality in India, I don't think was addressed in quite the same way, or even looked at, or even a conversation that I think women could have in society with their families as well as in the workplace,
Yes.
until corporations started stepping up and talking about gender inequality,
Yes.
right? Like until I remember years ago interviewing a pretty senior leader at a well-known financial institution around the world, but their India head for that organization. And she really talked about how they looked at, this issue of how specifically in India, around motherhood, around marriage,
Yes.
around that sort of issue, for the life cycle of especially Indian women, or the corporate professional cycle for
Yeah.
women in India, would get deeply impacted, and how then the company would have to come up, and did come up, with great policies around how, for example, women couldn't get demoted when they were, out on maternity leave. They would create special policies well before remote work, where for their star ambitious women who had to move because, again, societally, culturally, often they found that a lot of the very successful women would leave the company because their husband would get a transfer or whatever in a different place. So they started creating policies around that. So I absolutely think it's the role of companies and company leaders to
But
step
Ruchika,
up
I would
to.
say that even now, I mean, through COVID, we've seen that even more. And I've seen women going through a lot in terms of inclusion, also the inclusion of mental health facilities. So if you are on certain medication, we know that the performance may go down, or the person may, need some time off. And I'm not sure if we have those policies right now. So
We don't.
in terms of mental health inclusion, what are some of the key strategies that you would advise?
Yeah, a couple of the strategies are, I think that a lot of leaders need to lead by example. And where I have seen here in the US, where I've seen movement, is when leaders will say, here are the mental health issues I'm dealing with, or here are the issues I'm dealing with right now, especially in COVID. I'm the caregiver to young children, or I have aging parents, or I myself have been impacted by health stuff. And I think when you can create that safety to have an open discussion about what's really going on, I think that is one way. And this is a very human to human, empathetic leadership trait that we know everyone needs right now, given the situation and pandemic we are in the world. I think the other thing that I think is often lacking is, I think that we have not created the guidelines within an organization to allow people to work at their own pace, which is really surprising given that we're in a remote work environment. We've had no choice but to, most of us have to continue working from
Oh,
home. 2 years ago, this was not even a case. I mean, I had clients who 2 years ago said there's absolutely, in zero circumstances would we allow people to work from home. In zero circumstances would we allow them to be hired in a different location than where our headquarters is, et cetera, et cetera. And now look at where we are in the world. So a big part of that was that we've always done business this way and we can't change it, even though we have the technology. And now we've proven that, no, you can. So the next part is pushing that even harder and saying, we trust you to work at your pace. We trust that you will be productive, and that you will do it at a way that is right for you, whether that's because you have caregiving duties, whether that's because you're on, as you said, medication and you have mental health challenges. but we need to create policies to allow people and feel empowered to work at their own pace in their own way.
So, like you said, for leaders to set their examples, do you also think that women in general, if you're talking about women inclusion, do we need to be more assertive for our rights?
You know, this is really tricky because I will say there's a nuance here where, again, gender norms and the gender schema has made it so that when women are quote unquote assertive or stronger or exhibit dominant group traits, they're actually penalized for it. So
Yes.
there is a punishment if you're a quote unquote strong, ambitious, dominant, aggressive, those sorts of traits that are usually associated with men in a very patriarchal and a very binary gender schema. I think it's very challenging. So I'm always cautious to tell women what to do to improve, and that has actually been very much what my career has been built on. I deeply reject this idea that like women need to do all these different things to be successful, right? I think there are common traits that everyone should do to be successful in the workplace: be empathetic, be kind, be compassionate, be whatever, work as you can, etc., etc. Bring your best selves to work. I also think that asking women to change the way that they show up in the workplace is really unfair, and I think that's part of the patriarchy that tells us dress this way, behave this way, be confident, don't be confident, be it's a very and many women in fact have had very conflicting pieces of feedback. I've met many women who are told, one manager will say, be confident. Another manager will say, be less confident. Sometimes the same manager will say two conflicting pieces of
Yes.
feedback in the same week or whatever it is. So, I caution against telling women to be more assertive. What I will say, what I think will help and has helped me personally is the importance of building a tribe and the importance of building a community of women and I think allies who are like-minded and who can propel you, right? Like when you're going through a tough time at work, when you're going through a tough time, with your manager or whatever it is, when you want to have a very important conversation, say a salary raise conversation or something, you have that community of people who can propel you up. I'd say that's much more my advice to women than asking them to change the way that they
And I think
present.
that requires for them to be vulnerable enough and be courageous enough to tell their story.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
once
And
that, yeah,
sorry, go on.
I said, once that starts happening, you will see a lot more, leadership from their side as well.
True. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of mental health through the COVID, have companies in the United States sort of established specific norms for inclusion?
Depends on the company. And that I think has been the hard part. And, in many ways, there's a lot of discussion here about quote unquote something called the great resignation, where workers with privilege and options are able to change companies and change and take more control of how they want their workplace to be in this COVID era, and certainly post COVID, whenever we get back to a more whatever the new normal is. But I think that what we're starting to see a lot more here is, people are resigning from companies that are not being inclusive. So I've heard of people refusing to take on jobs at a company that says, you have to be back at the office 5 days a week, or resigning from companies that have not been inclusive in other ways as well, whether it's through parental leave and caregiving policies, whether it's, not the company's operations or way of doing business has not aligned with their values. And now there's a lot more options since a lot more companies are remote and hybrid. So I think that I think there are companies that are doing good work, and a big part of that is trying to figure out, how our workers, how do they like working at home or not? Do they have what they need to be successful? Do we have the tools to ensure that if someone wants to indefinitely work from home, we can still support them and make sure that they won't be impacted. Their careers won't be derailed by that accommodation that they need. So I think that certain companies are doing good work. I can't say for sure that anyone's, got this perfectly down. And I think part of that is because the situation is very volatile and it keeps changing for sure here too.
And since you have a fair picture of where I'm coming from, so what would be your suggestions primarily for somebody who's from the corporate sector? Maybe they're watching our show. What are some of the key features? Like you said, leaders need to be more empathetic, more understanding, take perspectives, come out with their stories. But I often see that it's very difficult for the leaders themselves, especially the male gender, to be vulnerable enough, because that may not be acceptable. As you said, it's a patriarchal, strong society. So what are some of the key factors in promoting inclusion? In terms of LGBT, we are seeing companies come out and sort of recognize the inclusion. We've seen gender come out, like you said, over years. In terms of mental health, what is it that we can have? Is it more flexible thoughts and systems, like you said, to put in place?
Absolutely. I think definitely more open-mindedness about how a mental health challenge is not going to, or a diagnosis does not derail your whole career. And we know, and I think more and more, if you go back in history, you will see that there are some very, very successful people who probably hid mental health diagnoses and challenges, or may not have, and unfortunately been persecuted while they were alive. Just yesterday, I went to an exhibition of famed painter Vincent van Gogh, and again, really deeply impacted by psychosis and depression, etc., etc. And then unfortunately died by suicide. But in the course of his lifetime, just did incredible work, right? And was not at all given the tools he needed to be successful. I mean, now one of the most successful, artists of all times, but post his death posthumously. So I think we have an opportunity to reshape that narrative, and I do hope more leaders, especially male leaders, will step up and say, either this is what I'm dealing with. And I think one thing I will say here in the US, I'm starting to see more, at least on social media, acknowledgement of I have anxiety, I have depression, or I have these tendencies. I was recently in a meeting where someone said I have ADHD, and here are the ways that this shows up for me in, and this is what I need. And you might notice that I do this, that's because of this. And it created a very comfortable environment of safety. And I could imagine that had I also had, had I had a mental health diagnosis, or that I could be really open about it. So I think that openness will create a big change. I think rewarding leaders for being open about it is also something that is important. And this kind of cuts across all the work I do, which is, I think that we need leaders to be recognized both formally through performance reviews, bonuses, pay, etc., for being more inclusive, right? And we see that there are some companies here, Intel, Microsoft, etc., that actually tie executive compensation and bonuses to diversity, and that diversity has generally been race and gender. But I think as time goes on, I think we definitely need to add more intersectional marginalized identities to that. So, if you manage a team where people are able to, and again, big part of it is safety. Nobody should ever feel like they have to disclose any diagnosis. And, that's never what I'm suggesting. But if there was a way to ensure that people were safe and they could either anonymously or openly discuss and disclose issues they're dealing with, and managers were able to, to really, empower them and work with them and help them, succeed in the workplace, I absolutely think managers in those situations, leaders should be rewarded through various different ways. So I think we do need to rethink. In many ways, what COVID has shown us is what got us here is not going to get us there, right? And we need to work with that.
And so we also have a lot of the employee assistance programs, which companies are now, I can see they are offering, even in terms of mental health services. But as I said, the stigma is still very, very strongly prevalent, where, you see employees not coming forth for those programs. So how do we build an atmosphere of trust, honesty, empathy, like you said?
Yeah. Shraddha, one of the interesting things about employee assistance programs is I did an investigative story for the New York Times on counseling services at Google that were misused in certain cases, to suit the company, especially in situations of litigation. So I will say one of the challenges is employee assistance programs historically, and when we were writing the article, we found that the EAP was created somewhere around the, I think, 40s or 50s to essentially help identify employees who are alcoholics, right, and kind of keep a close eye on them. And so the history of EAPs hasn't always been one that fosters trust, right, and fosters openness. And at the same time, I've also heard from other people who have run EAP programs that that they're certainly created with a lot of goodwill, and they're created to really support the employee. And I think that communication often is lacking, right? And that worry is, if in a society where you anyway are punished for seeking mental health services, or you're sort of stigmatized for it, then you don't want to go into the workforce and
Right.
and be the person who's availing of those programs, etc. So I think a big part of it is going to be better communication. I think we need, again, more managers, leaders, people in positions of power to say, these programs exist, and maybe even be open. I've used them in the past, and I found them to be really effective. And they're completely confidential, and sort of reiterate how these programs operate before, and then that's when you can really expect people to use them. Otherwise, there's obviously a lot of mistrust
I think what you
there. And
highlighted here was also the communication between the different levels of leadership.
yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So, Ruchia, thank you so much. I'm going to sort of end with a note that I've seen on your Instagram page. Without being curious about other people and their experiences, we can't build empathy and diversity of relationships. I think that's a very, very strong takeaway. So, one of the last and the final comments, to create a more inclusive environment. Of course, we're seeing it all over the world. India is still taking its first steps towards it. What would be, something that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I again want to applaud you for the work you're doing, because I think that it is really very, very difficult. And I think even here in the US, there's a lot of stigma against mental health challenges in the workplace. I think one thing that is interesting, and a big cultural sort of takeaway. I don't want to say shock, but a sort of culture thing that I actually do appreciate is that there's a lot more openness for people in social settings to say, oh, I have a therapist, or I seek counseling, or whatever it is. I think it's become much more normalized. Again, it really depends on community. So that's where the intersectional lens matters, right? Like, you wouldn't go to it's rarer in a group of Indian people or other South Asian people that could say, oh, I have a therapist. But very common, for example, among white Americans, for example. um, but in society, I think it has been pretty, much more open than I've seen in any other place I've lived in, including the UK. Where I think that there's a lot more work to be done is in the workplace. And so for people who are managers, people leaders, working with colleagues and peers, again, try and be open, share those stories, really work towards doing your part to destigmatizing mental health issues. I think one of the more simple but meaningful ways we can start doing that is maybe by using social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, whatever or all three, or all of the others, and really just just sharing the articles. You don't. I'm not suggesting anyone has to disclose any diagnosis or share any personal details if they don't feel comfortable and safe doing so. But at least start destigmatizing, doing your part in sharing stories that already exist to destigmatize this.
And I think that was what our intention was from this talk. Thank you so much once again for removing time. We're really looking forward for your book, and I'm sure that's going to help our companies right here. And like you said, you've got a chapter on us, and hopefully that will benefit and keep our minds open as to what inclusion means, because I think COVID has had a huge impact on mental health. Uh, so thank you once again, and hope to see you soon someday in India.
Thank you so much for having me, Shraddha. Really enjoyed this conversation.